In the middle of the Pacific, a radar post few even remembered existed began to pulse awake.
Then, one blip. Another. And another.
Out there, miles away, the fleet sailed blind, trusting the calm more than the warning. But here's the thing. No one believed them.
And by the time command listened, the enemy was already in the sky.
June 3rd, 1942. The first pale light of dawn stretches across the horizon of Midway Atoll. Waves lap gently against the coral shore, carrying the salt and weight of the Pacific. On the small windswept island, a cluster of men hunch over bulky radar equipment, their eyes fixed on the faint green glow of the screens. The hum of the machines is steady, almost hypnotic. Operators listen intently through headphones, fingers poised above switches, ears straining for the slightest irregularity. Every blip could be routine, or it could be the prelude to disaster. Out in the open ocean, hundreds of miles away, the Japanese fleet sails in silent formation, carriers bristling with aircraft, battleships slicing through waves like knives. The U.S. fleet, smaller and scattered, depends entirely on early warning, then a flicker on the radar screen. A tiny, unremarkable blip moving steadily from the north. The operator's hand hovers, hesitates, then presses the intercom. A voice crackles to the command center. Unknown contacts. Bearing northwest, multiple aircraft. In that instant, a single radar station begins a chain of events that will decide the fate of the Pacific. By early 1942, the Pacific War was a storm in motion. Just 6 months had passed since December 7, 1941, when Pearl Harbor was struck, and the United States Navy was reeling. Japanese forces had seized Guam, the Philippines, and Wake Island. Their carriers prowled the waters of the Pacific with near impunity, and the Allies were scrambling to respond. The strategy of the Imperial Japanese Navy was clear. Establish dominance across the Pacific, neutralize remaining American power, and force a negotiated peace. For the U.S., the task was existential. With carriers scarce and battleships damaged, the Navy relied on mobility, intelligence, and anything that could tip the odds. Among those tools, radar, still a new and unproven technology, offered a faint glimmer of hope. Midway Atoll, a tiny cluster of islands 300 miles northwest of Honolulu, had suddenly become pivotal. Its location made it a potential springboard for either side. The Japanese could use it to lure out the remaining U.S. carriers, while the Americans could defend the Pacific perimeter. Intelligence reports hinted that a Japanese operation codenamed MI was underway, but details were sparse. The Pacific Ocean was vast, and carrier fleets were shadows moving hundreds of miles away from each other. Detecting them early could mean the difference between annihilation and survival. By this time, U.S. codebreakers had achieved a breakthrough. The intelligence unit known as Station Hypo in Pearl Harbor had deciphered Japanese communications, revealing that Midway might be the target of an impending attack. The news was urgent but incomplete. The exact composition of the Japanese fleet, its timing and route were uncertain. Military planners understood one thing clearly. Midway's defense would rely not on brute force, but on foresight, speed, and the thin thread of information the Navy could gather. Radar technology, though in its infancy, had begun to find its place in the Navy's strategy. Early systems like the CXM and SC types could detect large aircraft or ships at distances exceeding 100 miles under optimal conditions. But in practice, operators had to contend with false readings, weather interference, and equipment quirks. Many in the service still viewed radar with skepticism. Its warnings were often second-guessed in favor of traditional reconnaissance. Still, Midway's isolated position made radar indispensable. On the atoll, a handful of trained men manned the screens, aware that their vigilance might determine the survival of the fleet. Meanwhile, the Japanese meticulously organized their strike. Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto, architect of Pearl Harbor, commanded a fleet comprising 4 carriers: Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, and Hiryu, accompanied by battleships, cruisers, and destroyers. Their planes, numbering in the hundreds, were armed for maximum destruction. Japanese pilots, confident and experienced, anticipated little resistance. They expected the U.S. Pacific Fleet to be scattered and unprepared, their early warning systems inadequate. The stage was set for a confrontation where even a single day's advantage could prove decisive. Back on Midway, the radar station was quiet but tense. The operators knew the stakes. The screens offered no comfort, only raw blips, lines, and shadows. Training dictated that every anomaly be reported immediately, yet judgment was critical. One false alarm could waste valuable aircraft. One missed signal could doom lives. The men were young, mostly in their early 20s, yet the weight of the Pacific rested on their shoulders. Every second mattered. The isolation of Midway made these men unsung sentinels. With supply ships days away and reinforcements unlikely, they relied entirely on skill, attention, and coordination with the island's limited command staff. Observation towers lined the shore, binoculars scanning the horizon, while the radar station's humming consoles scanned the invisible expanse above and beyond. It was a silent war of anticipation. As the sun rose higher over Midway, the Japanese fleet remained undetected, still hundreds of miles away. Yet the first hints of its approach would soon appear: tiny ripples on the vast Pacific, faint echoes on a green screen, and messages whispered through the operators' headsets. A single radar station, quiet and unassuming, held the key to an unfolding battle that would redefine the Pacific War. The stage was set. The men were ready. All that remained was for the first contact to appear on the screen, and for history to begin its course. The U.S. Navy's deployment at Midway in June 1942 was a delicate balance of risk and necessity. Task Force 16, commanded by Rear Admiral Raymond Spruance, consisted of the carriers Enterprise and Hornet, accompanied by a small contingent of cruisers and destroyers. A second carrier, Yorktown, had been hastily repaired after damage at the Battle of the Coral Sea and joined Spruance's force. The American plan relied on mobility, surprise, and intelligence rather than overwhelming firepower. Every ship, every plane, and every sailor counted. Radar played a crucial role in this strategy. The systems installed on Midway were primitive by later standards, but groundbreaking for the time. The CXAM radar could detect large aircraft at roughly 80-90 miles in clear conditions, though rough seas or weather could degrade performance. Operators needed skill and patience. Distinguishing enemy formations from flocks of birds or false echoes required experience, concentration, and a calm mind under pressure. The radar teams were trained to recognize patterns, estimate numbers, and relay accurate information swiftly to the command center. On Midway, they were the island's eyes in the sky long before planes could reach the horizon. Meanwhile, the Japanese meticulously executed their plans. Yamamoto's intent was to draw out the remaining U.S. carriers and eliminate them in a decisive strike. His fleet included 4 fleet carriers, 7 battleships, 11 cruisers, and more than 400 aircraft. The carriers would launch waves of bombers and torpedo planes to neutralize Midway's airfields, then focus on hunting American naval forces. Japanese intelligence underestimated the speed at which U.S. codebreakers were intercepting and decrypting their communications. As a result, the U.S. was prepared for the general time frame and direction of the attack, a rare advantage in naval warfare. The American pilots on Midway were fewer in number but highly motivated. They trained for torpedo attacks and dive bombing missions, understanding that their success hinged not just on skill but on timing. A radar warning could give them the few extra minutes needed to intercept incoming aircraft before they reached the island's airfields or carriers. Commanders relied on this technology to coordinate launches, avoid ambushes, and maximize the limited strike force at their disposal. Communication between radar operators and fleet commanders was critical. Information flowed from the island to the carriers via radio, often across static-laden channels. Every word weighed for clarity. Operators had to report numbers, bearing, and estimated distance quickly. A single delayed transmission could allow enemy aircraft to gain surprise, while an overreaction could exhaust limited fuel and aircraft reserves. Every report carried a human dimension, the responsibility of hundreds of sailors, the lives of pilots, and the fate of a strategic point in the Pacific. The Japanese fleet moved deliberately. Reports from scouting aircraft identified Midway's positions and defensive measures, but they could not account for unseen eyes on the horizon. Japanese officers assumed that radar technology was unreliable, that early detection was improbable. This overconfidence would soon prove fatal. Meanwhile, on the atoll, men in radar towers, often overlooked in strategic discussions, understood that even the smallest observation could change the course of battle. The situation was tense but precise. Every variable mattered. Wind direction for bombing runs, carrier positions, aircraft fuel, pilot readiness, and radar accuracy. The vastness of the Pacific magnified each risk. A missed contact could allow the enemy to strike unopposed. A false alarm could expose aircraft to unnecessary danger. The balance between action and inaction was razor thin, and in those early hours of June 3rd and 4th, the calm surface of the ocean belied the storm about to erupt. As daylight spread over the atoll, the radar station remained vigilant. Operators scanned the skies and distant waves for the first hints of enemy approach. Unknown to the Japanese, their movements were being watched. Every blip on the screen, every subtle reading, had the potential to alert the fleet, coordinate air defense, and save lives. This tension, the convergence of technology, human skill, and strategic necessity, set the stage for the angles of the story, the human, tactical, and technological perspectives that together determined Midway's outcome. Radar in 1942 was still in its infancy, a marvel of science teetering between experimental curiosity and operational necessity. The systems installed on Midway, primarily the CXM type, were cumbersome, with large antenna arrays that required constant adjustment and calibration. Operators monitored glowing screens and listened through headphones for the faintest electronic signals, trying to distinguish aircraft from interference caused by birds, weather, or waves. Range estimates were imprecise, and tracking multiple contacts simultaneously tested even the most experienced crews. Yet, despite its limitations, radar offered a glimpse into the invisible. Where human eyes saw only empty sky and open sea, the technology revealed shape, speed, and direction. It created a layer of awareness that transformed strategy from reactive to proactive. In the vastness of the Pacific, where carriers could be hundreds of miles apart, this invisible line of detection became invaluable. Without radar, American forces would have relied entirely on visual scouting, exposing them to ambush and uncertainty. In this sense, the machines were more than tools. They were lifelines. The operators manning the radar station were young, often barely out of their teens, yet they carried responsibilities far beyond their years. Hours passed in dimly lit rooms, eyes glued to screens, hands poised over dials and switches. Every blip was scrutinized. Every anomaly could be a warning of approaching doom. They worked under constant pressure, knowing that one misread signal might mean hundreds of lives lost at sea or in the air. Fatigue was constant, but so was focus. Operators communicated in terse, precise language, translating abstract patterns into actionable intelligence. Their discipline was quiet, almost invisible, yet it was the hinge upon which the fate of the fleet turned. They were unsung guardians, stationed on a remote island with no reinforcements in sight, performing work that few others could fully comprehend. In the stories of Midway, their vigilance would later be recognized as a decisive factor, though at the time it passed almost unnoticed beyond the command center. Radar intelligence fundamentally altered U.S. tactical decisions at Midway. Fleet commanders could now respond to threats before they were visible, directing aircraft, repositioning ships, and preparing defensive measures. When operators identified a group of incoming Japanese planes on the horizon, the fleet could scramble fighters, alert Midway's defenders, and coordinate intercepts. Timing was everything. Bombers had to take off with precise fuel calculations, torpedo planes needed clear flight paths, and carriers had to remain positioned for maximum operational flexibility. The tactical advantage was subtle but decisive. Japanese forces, confident in their concealment and surprise, assumed the Americans would be caught off guard. Radar denied them that advantage. It transformed Midway from a potential ambush site into a controlled battlefield where U.S. commanders could make informed decisions. Each report allowed small, coordinated moves that amplified the effectiveness of limited resources. Technology and strategy combined in a way that would define the battle. Commanders on Midway and at sea relied on the information these young operators provided. Rear Admirals Raymond Spruance and Frank Fletcher understood that radar reports were both a tool and a responsibility. They had to trust the data while balancing the unpredictability of war. Orders were given, adjusted, and relayed with precision. Decisions that seemed minor on the surface, launching a squadron 5 minutes earlier, repositioning a cruiser, holding an aircraft on deck, were actually life-or-death choices guided by unseen signals on a screen. The leadership dynamic was one of quiet trust. The radar men were not issuing commands, yet their observations dictated action. A single accurate detection could prompt maneuvers that avoided disaster or seized opportunity. The interplay between human judgment, technological output, and command decision-making exemplified a modern approach to naval warfare, a synthesis of observation, analysis, and execution. From the Japanese perspective, the Midway operation was meticulously planned. Admiral Yamamoto and his staff expected a decisive engagement that would eliminate the remaining U.S. carriers and solidify Japan's dominance in the Pacific. Reconnaissance planes were deployed, scouting Midway and the surrounding waters, while intelligence officers calculated probable fleet positions. Yet even with this careful planning, there were gaps. Blind spots in the ocean, variables that could not be controlled. The Japanese assumed American detection capabilities were primitive. Radar was largely unknown to them in operational terms, and reports from their spies and codebreakers suggested a limited defensive presence at Midway. This overconfidence led to an underestimation of the U.S. response. The fleet moved forward expecting surprise to work in their favor, unaware that unseen eyes were already tracking their approach. Every decision they made, flight launches, carrier positioning, and attack timing, was calculated with the belief that the Americans were unaware, a miscalculation that would prove catastrophic. The stakes at Midway were not just tactical but moral. For the Americans, the lives of hundreds of sailors and pilots were balanced against the survival of the Pacific Fleet. The men operating the radar station, isolated on a tiny atoll, carried the psychological weight of knowing that even a small error could lead to overwhelming loss. This sense of responsibility permeated every action. The decision to report a faint blip, the careful interpretation of patterns, and the precise timing of communications. Strategically, the success or failure of radar detection would influence the broader course of the war. A delayed alert could allow Japanese planes to cripple Midway's airfields, destroy American carriers, and shift momentum entirely. Conversely, early detection could turn the tide, enabling U.S. forces to respond effectively despite numerical inferiority. This convergence of human diligence, technology, and strategy illustrates how warfare had evolved, Victory now depended not only on firepower but on intelligence, anticipation, and the moral commitment to act decisively under uncertainty. The psychological impact of radar detection on both sides cannot be overstated. For the Americans, knowing that approaching aircraft were visible before they reached striking distance provided a fragile confidence, an invisible shield that allowed commanders and pilots to prepare and act. Yet this awareness also heightened tension. Every faint dot could be the enemy. Every signal could be misleading. Operators lived with constant stress, their nerves taut as they translated abstract signals into life-saving intelligence. For the Japanese, the eventual realization that their movements had been observed shattered assumptions of invulnerability. Plans that had relied on stealth and surprise were rendered obsolete by unseen observation. Confidence became caution, boldness became hesitation, and the psychological edge they had carried into the Pacific was eroded before the battle even began. In this way, radar served not just as a technological advantage but as a tool of psychological warfare. Finally, the radar station exemplified the principle of interdependence in modern naval operations. Operators, pilots, ship commanders, and intelligence officers were all nodes in a larger network, each relying on the accuracy and timeliness of the others. A radar detection would trigger a chain of actions. Carrier decks would scramble aircraft. Fighters would intercept bombers. Torpedo planes would adjust approach vectors, and cruisers would reposition to minimize risk. This coordination demanded clarity, precision, and trust. Each participant understood that failure at one link could cascade into disaster. The radar station, though physically small and remote, acted as the nervous system of the defense. Its success depended not only on technical function, but on seamless human integration into strategy. A testament to the evolving nature of warfare where observation, technology, and human judgment intersected to create decisive advantage. The morning of June 4, 1942, broke clear over Midway Atoll. Radar operators, already on edge, noticed a steady line of blips moving across the screen. At first they were cautious, double-checking calculations and consulting each other. Then came confirmation. Multiple aircraft hundreds of miles away approaching fast and in formation. The intercom crackled as the operators relayed the alert to the command center. Unknown contacts, bearing 310 degrees, estimated 180 planes. This message set the Pacific on a knife edge. Rear Admiral Spruance aboard the Enterprise received the transmission and immediately began coordinating his forces. Fighters were scrambled from Midway's airfields, and carrier decks were prepared for simultaneous launches. Every second counted, fuel was limited, and timing would determine survival. The Japanese carriers were still over 200 miles away, unaware that the Americans had already detected their approach. They launched waves of bombers aimed at Midway's defenses, confident they would catch the island and its fleet off guard. But radar had removed that element of surprise. American pilots were vectored precisely toward the incoming formations, able to intercept long before they reached their targets. In the air, the first U.S. interceptors clashed with the Japanese strike group. Torpedo planes plunged from low altitude, drawing heavy anti-aircraft fire. Dive bombers climbed to altitude, timing their approach to hit the Japanese carriers as fighters engaged them. The coordination was painstaking, each maneuver choreographed in real time from intelligence delivered by the radar station. On the deck of the Yorktown, pilots prepared their aircraft with precision. Mechanics tightened bolts, fuel lines were checked, and the roar of engines echoed across the flight deck. The tension was tangible. Every operator, pilot, and officer knew that the first wave's success or failure would decide the opening hours of the battle. The first explosions occurred over Midway's airfields as Japanese planes attempted to land damage early. Anti-aircraft batteries returned fire, shooting down several attackers, but the radar reports had already given pilots a head start. Fighter squadrons intercepted Japanese bombers mid-flight, forcing evasive maneuvers and scattering formations. The meticulous timing, made possible by radar warnings, prevented catastrophic losses to Midway's defenses and kept the American carriers out of immediate range. In these hours, the radar station became the invisible commander. Every blip, every confirmation, every adjustment relayed to the fleet shaped the unfolding battle. Operators stayed glued to their consoles, shouting bearings, directions, and estimated numbers. Their voices guided pilots toward intercepts, dictated defensive maneuvers, and allowed commanders to maintain situational awareness hundreds of miles from the enemy. Even as Japanese pilots pressed their attacks, confusion began to spread within their ranks. Anti-aircraft fire from unexpected angles and the sudden presence of American fighters disrupted formations. Bombs that had been aimed at carriers missed, striking the sea or landing in isolated sections of the atoll. Each radar-guided interception chipped away at the Japanese plan, while the Americans, though outnumbered, maintained cohesion and strategic advantage. By mid-morning, the first decisive strikes were underway. Dive bombers, vectored by radar intelligence, found the Japanese carriers in vulnerable positions. Akagi and Kaga were hit almost simultaneously, flames erupting from their decks. Smoke spiraled into the sky, visible across miles of ocean. The Japanese strike force faltered, the meticulous plan unraveling under a combination of American planning, coordination, and, above all, early warning provided by a single radar station. In the span of a few hours, the tide of battle began to turn. The Japanese fleet, confident in its dominance, now faced a U.S. force reacting with precision. Radar had given the Americans what they lacked in numbers: foresight. The operators on Midway, unseen and unheard by the enemy, had altered the trajectory of the Pacific War. As the morning progressed, the battlefield extended across hundreds of miles of open Pacific. The Japanese carriers Soryu and Hiryu had yet to be fully engaged, and their aircraft pressed attacks on the American fleet in Midway's airfields. But the radar station continued to relay critical information, tracking every formation, every approach, every potential threat. U.S. carrier-based dive bombers, guided by the radar warnings, found Soryu unprepared. Planes were lined up on the flight deck, fuel tanks exposed and hangars open. In a coordinated strike, bombs ripped through the deck, igniting fuel and ammunition. Smoke and fire consumed the carrier in minutes. Meanwhile, pilots returning to the Enterprise in Yorktown relayed updates on Hiryu, now attempting to launch its own wave of bombers. Timing was crucial. Spruance's decision to hold some fighters in reserve, informed by radar updates, allowed them to intercept these aircraft before they could reach American carriers. The battle was now a deadly chess game in the air and at sea. Japanese torpedo bombers pressed low, vulnerable to anti-aircraft fire, while American pilots targeted carriers with precision dive bombing runs. Yorktown, despite previous damage, launched planes continuously, its decks crowded but coordinated. The interdependence of radar detection, pilot skill, and command decision-making reached its peak. Every transmission from the Midway station guided pilots' approaches, shaped maneuvers, and mitigated exposure to enemy fire. Hiryu, attempting to regain initiative, launched a final strike against Yorktown. Japanese bombers found their targets, hitting the carrier and igniting fires. Casualties mounted, but the radar's early warning had allowed partial evasive maneuvers. Damage control teams worked frantically, containing explosions and flooding. The carrier would eventually be lost, but not before its aircraft contributed to strikes that severely crippled Japanese forces. By afternoon, the outcome was clear. 3 of the 4 Japanese carriers, Akagi, Kaga, and Soryu, were destroyed or burning uncontrollably. Hiryu remained operational for a short window, but American dive bombers, once again vectored by radar intelligence, found and sank her before nightfall. The Japanese fleet, shocked and demoralized, began a slow, ordered retreat across the Pacific, its offensive power broken. The American fleet, though battered, had survived. Losses were limited relative to the Japanese, and the early warning from Midway's radar station had allowed commanders to preserve their carriers, coordinate air defenses, and inflict decisive damage. The chain reaction of detection, communication, and action demonstrated the profound impact of intelligence and technology combined with human skill. On the deck of the Enterprise, pilots returned from their missions exhausted but victorious. Mechanics and officers assessed damage, refueled aircraft, and prepared for possible counterstrikes that never came. On the island, the radar operators continued their vigil, unaware that their work had already changed the course of history. Every blip they had reported, every calculation they had made under pressure, had contributed to the survival of the fleet and the destruction of a significant portion of the Japanese Navy. The Pacific War would never be the same. The Japanese had suffered losses they could not easily replace. Experienced pilots, veteran crews, and 4 frontline carriers, all sunk within a single day. The U.S., still outnumbered in the theater overall, had achieved a victory that seemed improbable just hours before, and at the center of it all, unseen yet decisive, was a radar station on a tiny atoll, staffed by young men whose focus and skill had allowed strategy to intersect with opportunity. The battle concluded not with fanfare, but with a profound, silent acknowledgement of its implications. The Japanese Navy, once confident in its dominance, was forced into a defensive posture. The United States gained momentum, a psychological edge, and a tangible foothold in the Pacific that would shape the remainder of the war. Midway was more than a battle. It was a turning point, and the radar station was its silent, unsung hero. The sun set over the smoldering waters of the Central Pacific, painting a scene of both devastation and quiet triumph. The Japanese Navy had suffered losses that would resonate far beyond the immediate battle. 3 of its 4 frontline carriers destroyed, hundreds of experienced pilots killed, and scores of aircraft lost. These losses were irreplaceable in the short term, striking at the core of Japan's offensive power. For the Americans, the cost was lighter, but still significant. The carrier Yorktown had been damaged heavily, and dozens of aircraft and personnel were lost. Midway Atoll itself had sustained attacks on its airfields, but its defenses, bolstered by early warning from the radar station, had largely held. Casualties were tragic but limited, and the fleet retained its operational capability. What separated this engagement from many others was the pivotal role of intelligence and technology. Radar had allowed the U.S. Navy to anticipate enemy movements, vector interceptors accurately, and preserve its carriers. Without the early detection, Japanese bombers might have caught the fleet unprepared, sinking multiple carriers and altering the Pacific balance of power. The radar operators, stationed hundreds of miles from the battle's core, had effectively extended the eyes of the fleet across the ocean. Reports from commanders in the aftermath emphasized this point. Rear Admiral Spruance, assessing the battle in official dispatches, noted the timeliness of intelligence and rapid communication as decisive in reducing American losses and maximizing the effectiveness of counterattacks. Pilots who survived to recount the engagement frequently credited early warnings for saving their lives and guiding their attacks with precision. Historians later corroborated these accounts, highlighting that the Midway radar stations, while small in scale, were integral to operational success. Strategically, the battle shifted momentum in the Pacific. Japan had intended to lure the U.S. carriers into a trap, destroy them, and consolidate its territorial gains. Instead, the loss of 4 carriers forced a defensive posture, slowing Japanese expansion and leaving supply lines vulnerable. The U.S. Navy, emboldened by the victory, gained a psychological edge that reverberated through planning rooms, pilots' quarters, and the minds of both admirals and enlisted men. Midway also marked a turning point in the perception and adoption of technology in warfare. Radar, once experimental and viewed skeptically by some officers, had proven itself as a force multiplier. The combination of human vigilance and technological innovation demonstrated that battles could be won not just by numbers or firepower, but by foresight, coordination, and rapid dissemination of information. The Pacific, vast and unpredictable, had become a theater where unseen observation could dictate outcomes as decisively as guns or bombs. Amid the wreckage and the aftermath reports, the human stories emerged quietly. Radar operators returned to their screens even after the battle, scanning for any lingering threats. Pilots who had survived owed their lives to precise vectoring from the island. Commanders reflected on how split-second decisions, informed by technology and human interpretation, had changed the course of history. The emotional weight was profound. In the span of hours, courage, skill, and innovation had collided to save a fleet and shift the trajectory of a global war. The scene, both harrowing and triumphant, underscored a new reality in naval warfare. Midway was not merely a clash of fleets. It was a testament to the integration of technology, intelligence, and human judgment. And at the heart of this integration, unassuming yet decisive, stood a radar station. Its contribution invisible to the naked eye but pivotal in preserving the United States naval power. In the weeks following the Battle of Midway, the full magnitude of the engagement became clear. Japan's losses were staggering. 4 frontline carriers, Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, and Hiryu, gone, along with nearly 300 aircraft and seasoned pilots whose experience could not be quickly replaced. Strategically, this defeat halted Japanese expansion in the Pacific and shifted the initiative to the United States. For the first time, the U.S. Navy could plan offensives rather than react defensively. American reports emphasized the centrality of early detection. Admiral Chester Nimitz, commander of the Pacific Fleet, highlighted that timely intelligence had been instrumental in preserving our carriers and repelling the enemy. Historians later agreed that Midway demonstrated how information, rather than sheer firepower, could dictate the outcome of a major naval engagement. Radar operators, though largely unheralded at the time, had provided the critical seconds needed for pilots to intercept Japanese formations and for commanders to execute tactical maneuvers with confidence. The psychological impact on both sides was profound. Japanese morale suffered, shaken by the sudden loss of carriers and veteran air crews. Confidence in their operational invincibility eroded, forcing a defensive posture for the remainder of 1942. For the Americans, the victory fostered a sense of resilience and technological optimism. Radar, code-breaking, and disciplined coordination were proven to work, not in theory, but in the crucible of battle. Midway also reshaped naval strategy moving forward. The U.S. Navy now recognized the value of integrating radar, intelligence, and rapid communication into operational planning. Carrier-based warfare, once reliant primarily on numbers of planes and ships, now included a critical element of prediction and detection. Radar was no longer experimental. It became standard equipment on ships and at key outposts across the Pacific. The success at Midway demonstrated that even a small installation, correctly manned and integrated into command structures, could have strategic consequences far beyond its size or immediate environment. The human element remained central. Radar operators, often overlooked in the broader narrative of the Pacific War, were quietly celebrated in after-action reports and training manuals. Their vigilance had saved hundreds of lives, preserved key assets, and contributed directly to one of the most important naval victories in history. Pilots and ship crews, aware of the radar's guidance, acknowledged its role in every successful interception and evasive maneuver. In essence, the operators had extended the fleet's vision, allowing human decision-makers to act with clarity and precision where uncertainty had once ruled. Historically, Midway stands as a testament to the evolving nature of warfare. The integration of technology, intelligence, and human judgment illustrated that even in the vastness of the Pacific, foresight could overcome numerical disadvantage. It reinforced a lesson that would echo through every subsequent naval engagement. Information is as vital as firepower, and those who can see the invisible often determine the course of history. As the smoke cleared and the Pacific returned to its deceptive calm, the strategic consequences rippled outward. Japan's expansion stalled, its plans for dominance disrupted. The United States gained a psychological edge, practical experience in integrating technology with tactics, and a newfound confidence that intelligence could turn the tide of battle. And on Midway Atoll, the radar station that had silently tracked every movement of the approaching fleet remained operational. A quiet sentinel whose unseen vigilance had ensured that victory came not by chance, but by preparation, precision, and human resolve. Midway was more than a battle. It was a turning point, a moment when technology, human skill, and strategic foresight converged to alter the course of history. On a small atoll in the Central Pacific, a radar station, unassuming, isolated, almost invisible, became the axis upon which the fate of fleets turned. Its operators, young men facing the vastness of the ocean and the uncertainty of war, transformed abstract signals into life-saving intelligence. They were silent architects of victory, their vigilance bridging the gap between knowledge and action. The battle demonstrates how warfare had evolved. It was no longer a contest measured solely by the number of ships or planes, but by anticipation, coordination, and the ability to see before being seen. Midway revealed that the unseen, the faint blip on a radar screen, the decrypted message from a distant code, the rapid interpretation of shifting threats, could outweigh brute force. In this it foreshadowed the modern nature of combat, where information can be as decisive as firepower. There is also a human lesson embedded in the story. The radar operators did not fight in the air or at sea, yet their contribution carried the weight of the fleet. Courage is not always visible. Heroism does not always occupy headlines. At Midway, the quiet, relentless focus of a few individuals altered the lives of thousands, shaped a theater of war, and shifted the momentum of a global conflict. The Pacific would remain a brutal battlefield, but the events of June 4, 1942, marked the beginning of a new era. Japanese expansion was halted, U.S. confidence surged, and the value of intelligence and technology was firmly established. History often remembers the explosions, the carriers, the pilots, but Midway also remembers the unseen eyes that watched, calculated, and warned. In the end, victory at Midway was a combination of chance, preparation, and human resolve. And while the ocean reclaimed the smoke and flame of that day, the story of the radar station endures, a reminder that sometimes the quietest voices, the smallest stations, and the most vigilant eyes can change the course of history itself. When the battle ended, the ocean was littered with steel and silence, and the radar station that changed everything, forgotten, buried beneath decades of waves and memory. History isn't just made by those who fight, but by those who see what others refuse to. If stories like this remind you why the past still matters, then help keep them alive. Subscribe, share their names. Because every untold story fades a little more with every passing tide. This was Midway, where an island of signals saved a fleet of men.